Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is an alert program or a warning for something that has potential anyway, I'm going to get right into it. What I'm talking about is, and it's going to pay you guys to listen to this program to the end because it's probably going to be about 10 or 15 minutes of something that you need to hear. Well, where we're going to get started is we're going to open up the charts right here, and we're going to take a look at what's going on. In world news here, let me scroll down just a little bit. One of the big stories is the YVR on alert for deadly coronavirus spreading from China. Let's go on here and take a look at these stories coming out of about this new coronavirus. Now, what is a coronavirus? Well, a few years ago there was a coronavirus called Sars, and it's like a head cold that goes down in your lungs and causes pneumonia. And some people get it really bad, and they just can't breathe without being in an oxygen tent. And a lot of people will get it, and they'll get just regular pneumonia. They'll get over it after a while, but it has a certain mortality rate. So let's read a few of these stories. It says, new Chinese virus will have infected hundreds. And then China says China is reporting 4 more cases of the new coronavirus. They're saying here, could this be disease X? Everything you need to know about the mystery virus gripping China. Now it says China reports new Wuhan virus cases ahead of key holidays. So people are moving around a lot, you know. 3 major U.S. airports to check for incoming passengers for the potentially deadly virus. Second person has died from... Now, see, this is in the early stages of this virus. I've heard an article here, and I'm trying to find it, where it says that they think up to 1,700 people possibly have contracted this new virus, but I'm trying to find the article here. I found it earlier, and it seems to be eluding me right now, but here it is. Business Insider, new China virus has likely infected 1,723 people, not 45, according to scientists. So evidently it's spreading, and it's spreading fast, and it must be spreading from human to human if 1,700 people have come down with it. And the Chinese have admitted that it's they've said probably spreading from human to human. But they're really not sure because this is such a new virus. Why this is so bad? Let's go back and take a look at history. See all these people in beds? These are pictures from the Spanish influenza that happened back around 1918. Let me focus in on some of these pictures, you know. And worldwide, it killed many people. It's part of the worst pandemics of human history. Let's take a look at the worst pandemics here in human history. And what we see here is a list. The Asian flu, 1956 through 1958. The flu pandemic of 1918, that was the Spanish flu. It killed more people than all the world wars. You know, the Spanish flu did. And now, why is some of these diseases, and they list the Black Death here of the Middle Ages, you know. Some of these plagues can kill millions of people. Look at this one, the Plague of Justin, 1541 through 542. Death toll 25 million. Now, that's back when the world wasn't as populated as it is now. People are moving from place to place. They're going everywhere nowadays, you know. And our way of life has completely changed, you know, in the modern era from what it used to be. These are pictures of farms from the 1930s. You know, people had a much more sustainable way of life back in these days, back in the old days, you know. They had small farms that dotted the countryside. And they were much more self-sufficient. than they are now. People weren't crowded in cities so much. And there wasn't these airplanes flying across the Atlantic on dozens of flights daily, flying across the Pacific. People, it's not uncommon nowadays from people to move like from China to America in one day. Like they get on an airplane and they were in China the night before and the next day they're in America, you know? And people move around like that now. Back in the old days, these rural communities were much more isolated. They never saw strangers come into their community. It's much harder, for a disease to be transmitted if you're isolated from it, and the disease doesn't have a means of spreading itself. Because in the modern society, this kind of modern world we've created, where people they can tend to move so quickly from one place to another via the type of modern transportation system that we have. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is mortality rate and why this is important to diseases like this. We've all heard of this frightful disease that comes from the deepest, darkest parts of remote Africa, and it strikes its victims, and a couple days later, Ebola, it strikes its victims, and a few days later, they're dead, And we're all terrified of this disease, terrified it's going to get loose in the world and people are going to fly in from some other country with Ebola and we're going to catch it, It's a terror disease because it has such a high mortality rate. But I'm going to explain something to you guys, and it's a little bit difficult maybe to understand, but I think you're going to understand it pretty quick when I explain it to you right now. Some of these worst diseases and worst types of influenza or whatever, they tend to burn themselves out because the disease needs to have a continuity of moving from one host to another host. And when the host dies, the disease quite often will die with the host, In the case of Ebola, the disease will live on, the person is infected, but the person's dead, they can't spread it anymore. A disease will burn itself out that way if it destroys the host too quickly. So we have to watch the mortality rate very carefully. So if it's got an extremely high mortality rate, you're going to find that humans as a group will be more frightened of it. And what we will do is we'll isolate ourselves. We'll create quarantine conditions because of that fear that it generates. We all know that the flu, the ordinary flu that we have, we don't quarantine ourselves. We don't say, well, okay, I'm not going to go to work today because somebody might have the flu in my office. Sure, you go to work, even though that person has the flu. But if the flu has had a 90% mortality rate, then we would say, hey, I'm not going to go to that office. There's a deadly flu there. Well, this is the way it works its way all the way through the system. So if you have a disease that's much more feared, like Ebola, that has a higher, I think it's 70 or 80% mortality rate in worst case scenarios. Generally, it's a little bit less than that. It might be 50-50 mortality rate. 50%, in other words. People are so frightened of it that the disease tends to burn itself out because the host tends to be so frightened that they create quarantine conditions surrounding the disease so the disease cannot be spread or transmitted. When you get a disease like the flu, which has probably less than 1% mortality rate, then people aren't so scared and the flu ends up being more successful at transmitting its way through the world's population, which it does every winter season. Flu goes around. We're ordinarily used to that, but it's not a particularly deadly flu like the Spanish influenza, which had about a 20% mortality rate. Now here's the worst part is, when you get a disease that falls in that certain percentage of mortality rate, somewhere probably around 5%, it's bad enough to slow down the entire world because it's got a much higher mortality rate than the flu, but at the same time, you're not, and especially if it's extremely virulent and it spreads very quickly. At the same time, you've got something that has enough mortality rate where it can slow down and stop the whole world. And I mean, we're on the verge. The world is on the verge of collapse now. If something comes along that has like a 4 or 5% mortality rate, and it makes the people that live through it extremely ill for maybe a period of weeks or even months, then you've got something that could throw the world into a condition that we are already ripe. The financial system's already ripe for collapse and chaos, and the world is already in a position where it's ready to go into a decline anyway. You get something that comes along and slows everything down to almost a creeping stop, then you got huge problems on your hands. And so, uh, especially something that was spread very readily and fast through the population. So I am putting out a red alert on this because this is fitting the bill, this new disease. Let me take a look here. This new coronavirus is kind of fitting the bill with the mortality rate. We see about 40 some odd people have come down with it in China, according to the Chinese reports. And 2 of those people are dead. And you have to understand that most of those people that have it are in hospital and they're being taken care of with the most modern medical techniques available. So if this were to spread worldwide and flood the hospitals full of victims that have this disease, it just seems to me that a lot of the people that come down with it would not have adequate medical care. So the mortality rate would probably go up, maybe double. I don't know. It'd probably go up substantially. So if we're looking at around 40 people in the hospital right now that have it in China, and 2 of them have died already, that would represent what, 5%? But now, if this thing were to spread worldwide, what would be 5% of the world's population? Would be millions and millions of people. So we're putting out an alert on this, that this disease is here now, and it's, as they're saying here, it says disease X, SARS-like virus spreading through China, promptly alerts, and they say it's really concerning. This is the Express from the United Kingdom. Let's just take a quick look at this article, Express from the United Kingdom. Just a second here. The Express from the United Kingdom. Disease X, SARS-like virus spreading through China. Prompts alerts. It's very concerning, according to what they're saying here. And I agree, because of probably of the mortality rate and the fact that the people that don't die from it are probably put out of commission. In other words, they're not able to go to work. They're not able to fulfill their obligations or their duties or anything else for probably weeks, while their lungs they would slowly, make a very slow recovery. And if your lungs are full of mucus, you're not able to operate at your normal functioning ability. Let's just put it that way. And if this were to spread worldwide very rapidly, basically what I'm saying is it could shut everything down. I mean, it could shut everything down. SARS-like virus spreading through China, prompting alerts. Very concerning. A new strain of infectious disease, apparently on the rise across Asia, is leading to widespread concern about the disease's dangers and even accusations of an official cover-up in China. Sir Dr. Jeremy Farrar, director of Wellcome, revealed to Express UK how such a disease epidemic represents one of the greatest and enduring threats to global health. He said a cluster of patients with an unusual respiratory infection is and should always be a worry. The level of concern raises again when the illness is linked to an animal food source. This is how new viruses jump across species barriers as was the case with SARS, MERS, and avian flu and Ebola. So we're facing something here that I'm really watching carefully. I'm really putting alarm bells up on this thing. My alarm whistles are really going off right now, and because I see the mortality rate is not real high, but also it incapacitates the people who catch it. And this could make things spiral out of control in the world if everybody in the world or a significant portion of the population were to come down with this thing. What spin-off effects would it have on everything and everything you do? Because we have to stay running every single day. There's people, many people keep the system running in their own way, in their own facet, in their own job. My job is to report on the news. My job is to report on the financial system. And I do that job every day, I mean, I'm like one cog in a giant machine. There's millions of people out there. They get up, the postman gets up and he goes and sorts the mail. The grocery store item stacker, he puts the items on the shelf for your everyday use, for every day, And if all these people get sick all of a sudden, it can shut down everything, and then that has spin-off effects again, because then a lot of people are not going to be. I mean, it's just the world can melt down into a mess. We can't all get sick at once. Who's going to do all the work? Who's going to do all the jobs if we're all sick? And I mean, they call this, I guess, an SHFT. If something like that were to happen, And the thing is if it were to get too bad, it's like Humpty Dumpty sitting up on the wall. He's an egg, Humpty Dumpty was an egg. It says, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty took a great fall. And all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And that's the way with our fragile system that we've created for ourselves worldwide. It's actually very fragile. And a disease like this coming out of nowhere, we got to watch this very carefully. So this has been your alert on this. Thank you guys for listening. Like and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next show.